question about your career and your background is, what brought you into doing the type of research that you do, such as you said you were working on like a statistical publication with another individual. So what brought you into being interested in that type of research?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying there's this pithy little saying that some people have is that research is me search. And I think probably for some people it is. I mean, you hear a lot of stories of people who, let's say for them, they themselves are ADHD, and part of trying to understand themselves led them to a research career studying attention deficit disorders. I don't think for me that's really the case. I think, on the methods side, I've always been very interested in precision and tools. And I do think one thing that limits psychology, because what we study is so complicated, is having new tools, new developments for ways to study and understand things. So I think my interest in having good tools led me to become somewhat of a methodologist early on. My first study as a grad student was about self-esteem. And I realized there were 10 different ways to measure self-esteem, and they didn't correlate very highly with each other. So my question was, well, which one is really self-esteem? What is self-esteem? Maybe it isn't any of these 10 things. And part of that led me to questions about, well, how do you measure these abstract concepts that don't have any real physical representation in people? Otherwise, I've just become very interested in people's ability or lack thereof to make good choices, for lack of a better way to phrase it. Mostly these days in the health domain. How do people make good choices about any aspect of health, from getting enough sleep to eating well, to drinking in moderation, to being careful with uses of substances and the like. And you have to have both personality and social psychology to get a good handle on that. So, for example, some years ago, I and some colleagues developed a measure of sensation seeking. We found that many people use substances for the sensation it provides. And it turns out that's a personality trait. So and it's who they are. You're never going to make them not be a sensation seeker. So then the question becomes, how do you keep people who are high sensation seekers from getting in trouble? Are there things in their environment that you can help them structure? And so anyway, all those kinds of questions, very much, my heart is very much in personality and social psychology. And I will just say one other thing. I dabbled a little bit early on in psychopathology, clinical psychology. And ultimately, I really felt like, no, it's the sort of normal range of behavior that interests me, less than psychopathology.
Right. So going along with that, you talked about like the different fields of psychology, the wide, broad range of fields. What careers are available to you if you are interested in helping others and talking to other people?
Yeah. And I can give you a little bit from my experience and then some just from what I know generally. I, for example, for the last 2 years have been a consultant to Facebook. And I spend probably 5 hours a week consulting with their well-being research group. So you might not know that Facebook has a well-being research group, and it is fully staffed by psychology PhDs. In other words, these are people who were psychology majors. They went to graduate school in psychology, and their first job was at Facebook. And it was doing research. And in this case, it has to do with trying to understand the ways in which social media contribute to poor functioning on the one hand. And I think in their best wishes that there would somehow be a way to make the case that social media can make life better. And by the way, that itself is a kind of a swirling research arena. If you haven't had a chance to keep up much with it, there was a fairly high-profile paper that came out maybe 3 years ago suggesting that adolescent girls in particular were prone to uses of social media that led to depression and loneliness. And turns out it was some pretty bad research, and it was a fairly unfortunate headline, but it stimulated a huge amount of activity, both by faculty researchers, but also by the social media companies themselves. So anyway, that's an option. There's a company here in North Carolina called RTI. There used to be the Research Triangle Institute. They employ hundreds of psychology trained people from bachelor's level to master's and PhD level. And they do sort of contract research, a fair amount of marketing research. The sort of method skills psychology students get really pay dividends. And then, of course, there are careers that are in the helping professions. I know a little bit less about that. I do know that that's where the master's degree in psychology can come into play. None of the careers that I mentioned so far to reach as far as you might want to go would let you go far with a master's only. You would need a PhD, but a master's degree for someone who wants to get into clinical practice is perfectly acceptable. And there are a number of good master's programs in the state. And just for what it's worth, part of the rationale there is that insurance companies will now reimburse master's level practitioners who are practicing sort of under the supervision of a PhD level clinician.
So some students are also wondering what your PhD thesis is on, and if it would be great if you could give us a little bit of background into what you did in your research.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time ago, but it was a very early example, by the way, and I'm sort of proud of this, of what now has become a widely used technique called ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. And sometimes you hear them called beeper studies because the earliest versions, people wore a paging device on their belt, and at random intervals across the day, they would get paged. And when they did, they were supposed to complete a very brief and quick survey. And in some cases, they might get paged 5 times a day for a couple of weeks, which means you end up with 70 observations of people out in the world doing what they do normally that you can then use statistical methods to model. So mine was on, because I was interested in self-esteem at the time, does self-esteem fluctuate? And if so, what things in people's everyday lives cause it to do so? So I had people do exactly this. They gave me data on average 6 times a day for 2 weeks. And I had, so consequently 75, 80 observations of people. And I specifically was interested in whether different kinds of self-esteem fluctuated more. Like people have self-esteem sort of anchored in their appearance, for example, or self-esteem anchored in their social relationships. And so basically it allowed me to sort of, one, argue that self-esteem does fluctuate rather substantially. So it's not like a stable characteristic of people that's always at the same place, but rather it turns out it actually fluctuates quite a lot for some people. Furthermore, what we learned is that it fluctuates more when people are, and maybe this isn't surprising, or in novel circumstances around people they don't know, as compared to when they're in situations that they're accustomed to with people that they know. But it was a wonderful dissertation project because it let me use a lot of creative and interesting methods. The statistical methods to use those kinds of data are pretty fancy. And it was an early opportunity to both develop the skill. And then when I went on the market, it turned out to be a very marketable skill to demonstrate that I could both collect that kind of data and I could analyze it in profitable ways.